Good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started so that we can get through everything today and then move on with whatever retreats or pre-semester planning you have going on. Hi, I'm John DeBoer. I am in the School of Theater and Dance, and I'm on the APASP committee, the Academic Programs and Administrative Services Prioritization Task Force. And today we'll be going through a brief orientation of the academics or the academic programs side of the APASP process, and we'll specifically be addressing authorship of these program reports that you will be submitting by October 2nd. We had a pilot process this summer that was very informative about what exactly authors were going to need from both orientation, workshop, and polishing of their reports, as well as how involved the task force should be. Originally, we had decided to have our author trainers be somewhat of a buffer between the task force and the campus community so that they could act as advocates. But once we got through the pilot process, we realized we really needed to collaborate with our author trainers. So we're really grateful for everybody who's been helping with this process, Amy and Kelly, and they'll introduce themselves, as well as Robin and Joe, who are out in the room here today. One of the things we learned from the pilot was that we want to basically tell you exactly what we hope you will write so that we can be clear and precise with the information we receive so that we can make a fair evaluation of your program based on the criteria we have developed, the rubrics that we'll be using to measure that success, and ultimately placing programs into prioritization categories, which will come with a recommendation for action at the end of this process. Basically, the thing we want people to think about as you are approaching your report is ask yourself the question, how would investment in your program benefit the university and its mission as a whole? And how would disinvestment in your program diminish the university and its mission as a whole? And so we developed these 6 criteria for academic programs that will allow you to make your case in that regard. And so we'll move on to just a brief overview of the criteria and metrics, and we'll start at the very top of the criteria, and that would be required program information. First of all, just a quick show of hands so that we can move quickly. How many of you are familiar with the criteria and metrics of the APASP process already? Good. A majority of you, so we won't belabor the point. At the top of the criteria and metrics are program information that aren't weighted, and that's contextual information that will allow us to get a better understanding of your program before we get into the evaluative part of the criteria. It's also a place where you can give information that may not be clear in the centrally provided data that you will receive, and Dawn will get into that in a moment. But you will be able to tell us exactly how many faculty you are using, what their duties are, whether it's instructional, whether it's administrative, that sort of thing, as well as give us a brief idea of your mission as a program. Then we move into alignment with the university and its mission, and you'll notice that at the top of that, we're asking about the UM 2020 strategic plan. And one of the things that was very explicit in our development of this process was that we realize that we're at a place where we're right between a strategic plan that everybody's been measured against for the last 5 or 6 years, and we're on the cusp of adopting a new strategic vision. And so there's no way to really separate those two from the APASP process. You have been working under the strategic plan, and we will be working towards a strategic vision. And so we want to give you the opportunity to speak to both of those documents. So under alignment, we're focused on the strategic plan. We're looking at the essential nature of your program to UM and its mission. And then we move on to demand, where the data becomes more quantitative, and we're looking at actual numbers. And we're also looking for places where you are collaborating across campus, potential interactions between your program and other programs that make you a vital program on campus. And I'll turn it over to Ona to get to the next point.
My name is Ona Renner-Fahey, and I teach in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures. So John was just already mentioning demand, and one thing, as we're all teachers and know that when we students like to know when they're writing, right, what percentage of each category will go toward their final grade. And that is something to sort of look at, where alignment is worth 20% and demand is going to be worth 15%. And there's not a lot of discrepancy in the weighting between these. Most of them are between 10 and 20, but that is one thing to maybe take into account. So with demand, as John mentioned, we're looking at collaborations that your program is involved with in terms of student needs, but also faculty performance. So with this response, you're going to be considering not only interdisciplinary teaching, but also faculty collaborations, research projects, conference organizing that you might do with different groups, that kind of thing. And then in terms of impacts on other programs, you're looking, of course, within your college, but also beyond your college, within academic departments, but also within administrative services, and I think that's one area that we might forget. And so what I think I will do when I'm writing mine is actually look over units of analysis, the lists, to make sure that I'm not forgetting anyone. I think that we all think that we're not going to forget something, but I know that, for example, when I've done an IPR in the past, later on, I think I realized that there's something I've forgotten. And so you do have these lists in case you sort of forget, for example, maybe honors college or something that you've done like that in the past. In terms of the third criterion is productivity, and this one is back to 20%. And here we just want to see how you excel in your mission. And you are going to be, we're asking you to measure your productivity and asking you to describe briefly how your unit standards approach research, and that's going to be a challenge, I'm sure. And how well has your unit as a whole done here? So word limit here is going to be a challenge for a lot of programs. You don't have to list every article written and conference presentation made by your faculty, obviously, but do note highlights. Yes?
Do we have somebody with a mic out there? We're recording this, so we're trying to get everything on the mic.
So forgive me, I've been a chair for 3 weeks. So when you talk about productivity and research productivity, do you include full-time lecturers?
Sure. Yes, I would think so.
Okay, and what about adjuncts?
I would also say yes to adjuncts. Yes, if it's your department and what your department has produced.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. So then with this criteria, then you're moving on to do a similar thing with service and then with teaching. So this one is a lot, this criterion I think is going to be in some ways easier to write because it's sort of like what we've all been doing with IPRs. And the challenge is going to be word count in a lot of ways. And another.
Go for it.
I'm Kevin Bell in the School of Art. And one of the hardest things we have is distinguishing between productivity and quality. And hearing you talk about productivity, I'm wondering if you can tell me where the line is between those two categories. For example, you mentioned highlights of research. It's like, would that be under quality rather than productivity? I'm wondering if you can just give some insight into how to delineate between those two areas. Thanks.
I can give that a try. We've talked a little bit about the FEC process as something we're all used to doing as we go up for a normal or a merit or a promotion. And I think it's important to think about distinguishing between the normal activities of a faculty when it comes to productivity, what's expected, and what benchmarks people need to hit in order to move forward, and what brings them above and beyond. So if you have a nationally recognized faculty member doing nationally recognized research or creative scholarship, then that needs to be mentioned under quality. All right? If that's a faculty outcome that is considered outstanding by your unit standards, put it there. But when we're looking at productivity, we're looking at the volume that's of output that's there. Is your faculty being particularly productive? So I think you can be a little more specific under quality than you would be under productivity.
That's an excellent question, yes. Another one.
Phil Condon, Environmental Studies. What we've noticed is that the third bullet point question under this is a little bit different because it says instructional component not captured in quantitative data. The others don't say that. So we've been talking about what does that mean, but we'd like to know what it means to the task force. Why is it? We assume the quantitative data has to do with student credit hours and FTE and the ratios and all that, but so is this more the intangibles that we see in our instruction, the benefits, or whatever? We just like your perspective.
A lot of that can come down to things that don't receive student credit hours. Time spent in a lab, even if they're being a paid lab assistant and on work study, they're still receiving instruction from that experiential learning process. If they're working in the studio or in our scene and costume shop and it's uncredited time where they're expected to be there and the faculty are there mentoring, that's something we can't capture purely through the process of registration. So it's basically where do you go above and beyond when it comes to instruction, and where the centrally provided data can't capture that instruction.
Klaus Uhlenbrock from the Business School. I had a question about the 250 words. It says under centralized data, 250 words total. Does it mean Dawn has 250 words to spend on this, or I as an author can respond to the data that's delivered?
Yes, that's 250 words to respond to the central data. And Dawn will elaborate on that a little bit more in a moment. Let's hold questions just for now until we get to the end of the criteria and we can take a few more.
Okay, so then we're looking then at the fourth criterion, quality. And here we are looking to see if you have strong student outcomes and demonstrate evidence of faculty excellence. As John had said, we're looking for more specifics in this section on how you've gone above and beyond. So here the two keywords are summarize and evidence. So again, you have to somehow be brief. We all have to somehow be brief when we write these reports. And we have to have evidence. So we have to all avoid fluff. And we all know that, but once we start writing, that's something that we need to be particularly careful about. And again, I think that this is going to be a challenge for bigger units as well, right, with a lot of students. And discussing faculty outcomes and then accreditation. So summarizing that with bullet points probably, and yeah, that's quality.
The last two criteria are efficiency and opportunity analysis, and this is where we can look at both the past and the future. Under efficiency, we're looking at ways that your departments and schools have found to work collaboratively and efficiently to make up for the fact that we've been losing resources over the last 5 years. The trend data for just about everybody is going to show a downward trend in terms of funding, in terms of enrollment. And so we want you to talk about the impact of that on your programs. We want you to tell us how you've been finding ways of making it through. And it's also the place where we're looking for how would reinvestment in your area prop you back up and bring you back to being whole as you see yourself being whole. And in opportunity analysis, we're looking for your integration with that strategic vision, opportunities that you would have there, different ways that you're meeting the needs of workforce and the state, and opportunities to perhaps restructure and reinvent the way that your program is delivered, your curriculum is delivered. This is a tough one for a lot of folks because it's you asking, how could I be different? How could I walk away from the things that I've been comfortable with and doing for the last 20, 25 years and potentially reinvent myself? There are going to be programs on campus that are going to want to make the argument to stay the same and to not restructure and not reinvent. But what we're asking for here is just a little bit of creative thinking and forward thinking about something you might be able to do. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be gospel and we'll hold you to it, and now you are committed to joining forces between two programs and becoming one program. It is simply a suggestion for a way of opening up new opportunities for the university. So those are the criteria and the metrics. Are there any other questions before we move on to the big questions about data?
Can I add, I just want to add one brief thing while we're on the last opportunity analysis. I just wanted to share with you that in our department, our younger, newer colleagues have been the ones who've come up with some really great ideas for looking ahead to the future. They're not married to sort of how things have been, and so I would just encourage you to maybe ask them to put some thought into that, because ours have come up with some really great ideas.
Yeah, it's Jim Staub from Geosciences. Relative to the criteria and the metrics, at the beginning, the required program information, there's 5 of them. And everything else you list that you want 250 words in total or per bullet for each one of those 5 items. Is there a word limit or?
We missed that one. Yes, it's 250 words each. So for 1, 2, 3, and 4, you have 250 words. The number 4 area will be an actual form that you get to fill out, but for the answer, the mission, and all of that, the standardized organizational chart will give you 250 words.
Hi, this is Laura Young from the College of Forestry and Conservation, and my question is related to the discussion of the instructional components that aren't captured by the centrally generated data. Are internships and independent studies included in those student credit hour counts, or do we need to capture those under this bullet? Sorry, this is bleeding over into data.
It's not my turn yet. I believe so, because I think most of those, well, let me back up. If the course is taking for credit, then it will be captured. If it is an informal internship, just for filling a requirement, then it is not captured. Okay.
Dennis Stanicki, Sustainable Construction Technology. Just so there's no ambiguity, could we go through all the acronyms in number 5, efficiency, and define them?
Oh, go for it, Don. Please.
Are we talking about the centralized data component there? In criterion number 5, the very first part, because I don't see any acronyms in the other part.
5YALSCH.
Yep. Okay, so there is a definitional sheet that goes through a lot of these as well, which we'll talk about later, but let me share with you that when we talk about the 5-year average, what that means is you will see 5 years worth of the data, and you're going to be measured against the average of those 5 years. Okay, so anytime you see 5YA, that's what we're talking about. SCH is student credit hours. An FTE is a full-time equivalent, and it depends on whether or not you're talking about a student or an employee as to how you define that, but that's what FTE stands for. It's important that we are always measuring things. You understand we're measuring things by FTE. A lot of times we'll say, well, I've got 6 instructors in my department. We're not picking up head count. If each of those instructors are only carrying half a load or only getting paid half time, you really only have 3 instructors in this. Everything is by FTE. The T/TT is a tenure track faculty. So now we're trying to divide your instructors into different groups. This would not include the adjuncts and the instructors that were asked before, anytime we do T or TT. In the parentheses, when we've got the 2Y, the UG, the professional, what that's doing is identifying which sector of our institution is going to have that metric. So if it says 2Y, that means it is a Missoula College metric. We will have that information. If it says professional, it's only going to be the graduate or professional areas. G is graduate and UG is undergrad. I think that is all of them in the list.
And I just had Amy pull up the terminology definitions, and we've got clarifications on just about anything that might be confusing and what we specifically mean by this. Dawn's also going to have a separate set of definitions that is going to allow you to track through the centrally provided data as well. So if anything's not clear, if anything pops out to you and you want more clarification, the terminology is under About on the APASP website, and you can just pull up this PDF and take a look.
I have one quick question on bullet point number 2 under efficiency, where it refers to possible show how the program's efficiency compares with national benchmarks. Faculty asked me to find out where we go. What would you be looking at as national benchmarks for a program's efficiency that we might compare to?
Well, if you have an accrediting body for your program, usually national benchmarks would be there under the accrediting body, but there's also, I suppose, the comparative data across disciplines would be done.
You know, I've had a couple people, I don't know if they're looking at this one specifically, but there's been requests for Delaware data. If you're interested in that, we can go ahead and give you some of those benchmarks to help with that. I think from my perspective, what you would be looking for is a respectable body. So it's not just some one-off that did a survey. It is an organization that's doing some national comparisons. That's what they're looking for.
I mean,
The Delaware study talks about productivity and cost.
Okay.
So there is a cost per credit hour generation.
Ann Delaney, Missoula College. At Missoula College, we have a number of programs that have prerequisite time, so they're pre-program students. How do we differentiate between pre-program and program graduates?
Sounds like a data question.
Yeah. Assuming that it's a data question, we've worked with a couple of units on this, and there's actually 2 different paths depending on how your unit defines the pre. If the pre is really meant just as kind of an alert to the department that there's students that are going to be interested in it, and they're taking kind of their gen ed and they're really not into your program, we're going to roll those together because that's consistent with how some of the other majors are doing theirs, where they don't have pre's. If it truly is a pre-program that requires admissions into the program, nursing is the perfect example over in your area, we have to keep those separate because there is no way that all of those nursing students are going to get into that major of nursing.
And we're pre-radiology, have the same thing.
Yep, yep.
Yeah, Howard Beale Pharmacy. Back to productivity and that last bullet about instructional component not captured in the quantitative data. When we talk about student credit hours, now we have experiential students who go across the state and they work with our faculty in various institutions, and by board rule they can only have 2 students at one time. And comparing that with a lecture class that has 200 students in it, and we talk about that's quantitative data because they do sign up for that course. How does that do we include that in that bullet then? Just comparing student credit hours, which are not really all created equal?
In my opinion, you have 2 opportunities to address that. You could address that in the 250-word centrals provided this data. You need to articulate that there's restrictions that are on those credit hours, or you could very well put it down in this point, depending on wherever you think you have room in the 250 limit. Okay.
Nicholas Wonders, Mathematics. Under criteria 2, the centralized data, I see the student credit hours for gen ed courses, but what about the total of the undergraduate student credit hours?
It sounds like we're moving on to data, so I think I'm going to throw it over to Dawn now.
Dang it. That's a good question. There's been lots of discussion about that fact. There actually is not a metric on the entire spreadsheet that shows what your total credits are going to be. The place where you're going to get it is in the next bullet where it says the SCH ratio of non-majors, while the metric is actually going to measure the percent. The data that you're going to receive will be the numerator and the denominator, so that you'll be able to see the total number of credit hours that you're getting credit for, but it's not actually weighted in the metrics. Okay. All right, so I am Dawn Russell. I have the pleasure of leading an outstanding group in the Institutional Research Office. I am an ex officio member trying to support the task force as they're going through this. I'll also offer out to you guys that we're happy to help as you're going through your writing. You want to understand the data a little bit better. You want to have some ideas of how you could present it or some of the nuances. That's kind of what we do, so happy to help you out in that fashion. But I do have 2 pieces that I want to walk through. I get to talk about the technical stuff, which is usually the boring and nobody really cares about, but it is important. So I do want to talk about the submission process that we're going to go through for the APASP stuff. The very first thing that you need to be aware of is we need to know who your author is. Now, on the units of analysis out on the website, each one of your units of analysis has an author listed. That author needs to be our contact person, okay? They are not the only one who is responsible for the submission, but they are our contact person. We strongly recommend that you work collaboratively on these within your unit and across the campus, whatever makes sense for your area, but we need a point of contact, and that's going to be that author. So that needs to be finalized in the next couple of days, so take a look at that. If there is anything that doesn't make sense to you, you need to alert us now, otherwise we're locked into that as your author. The author is going to be the person who receives all of our specific unit information. So I'll walk you through when we talk about the central data that's specific to your unit of analysis. That is only going to be sent to the author, and it is our expectations that the author would then send that off to whoever needs to be involved in the report writing. We can't possibly figure out everybody who needs to be receiving this information, so that author is very important. They're also going to be the ones that receive the email reminders. Any questions that might happen as they're going through the process or whatever. So they're really our point of contact. So make certain that author is the correct individual, and those of you who are not listed as authors know that that is your contact person if you want to find out information from the task force. Okay? Let's talk a little bit about how you're going to interact with the system. So the first thing that's going to happen is the author is going to receive an email, the call for the submissions. We're hoping this is going to go out next Friday, somewhere in that time period that's going to go out. What that email is going to have in it is a link to the software that you're going to use for submitting your report. Okay, it's Exceed. If you've done anything with the graduate what's the conference? UMCR. If you've done any submissions for that or been engaged in that, it's the same software that we use for that. That email is going to have the login and password. There's only going to be one identified, and I know some of the authors have joint people that are listed on there, and for communication sometimes that's important. If you're going to be gone for a week and you don't want your stuff to just be sitting in a black hole, you may need to have a backup person for the communications. We can do that, but we can only provide one login and password. So again, it's going to be the responsibility of the author. If they need to have a backup person, that backup person needs to have that login or password. Okay? It'll have the submission directions, it'll have the directions to some other helpful resources that you might have, and then it'll also have a data sheet, which I will go over here in a moment. So that'll go out hopefully in the next week, and that's going to officially start the process, but please understand that we would like you to be working collaboratively on this, and probably your best approach is to do it within Word. Start sketching this stuff out. Don't use the Exceed to do your submission. So it doesn't mean you have to wait until next week to get started on this. You know the questions. You guys can start sketching out your answers and get working on it. Okay? Okay, next slide. All right, a couple of things about Exceed that have come up as we've gone through. People want to know how the software is actually going to work. So for those of you who haven't used it, Exceed will allow you to input images. So if you have a graphic that you want to input, just go ahead and make a copy of that, and then you can put that into your presentation. What we don't know yet is how that impacts the word limits, so we'll get that information out to you in a little bit. It does allow for you to create tables as well, so if you want to create a table to answer your question, you can do that in Exceed. It allows for you to format text. I think one of the things that we'll talk about later on is that you want to be concise in it, and sometimes bullets, highlighting, those types of things are a better way than having a full long paragraph. The software allows you to do that. You can save your work as you're going along, so if you get a phone call or something, you're not going to lose everything. You can work on it periodically and come back to it. You will receive a web confirmation, so after you hit submit, you will receive a confirmation page that says it has been submitted, so you'll know that you have completed your process, and you're able to download your entire submission from there in a PDF, or I think it's going to be a PDF fashion, okay? So that's pretty much how the software is going to work in the technical aspects. Let me switch gears now and actually talk about the data, which is everybody's favorite topic, right? The first thing, whoa. The first thing that I want to mention is that we had every intention of having the data embedded within your questions so that we would make this as easy and seamless as possible. But the requirements of what we wanted for the full process were very demanding, and we couldn't come up with a software that did everything. So the compromise that we've come up with is Exceed will pretty much do everything we want, but allow us to embed the data. So you're going to receive these data sheets that are going to have your unit of analysis specific data. You've been spending the last month going out to a website and filtering and trying to find your units and all that. You don't have to worry about that anymore. We're going to do that for you and provide these data sheets. So this is a sample one that we'll go ahead and post out on the training website, so you'll kind of see what these data sheets look like. Basic information up top, and then each one of the metrics. Amy, if you just scroll down a little bit, you can see each one of the metrics are going to be listed there, and you'll have all the information that you need to go to the metrics that are listed on the criteria, okay? One thing, you can go back to the PowerPoint now. The one thing about the data sheets, or just the data in general, it's not going to give you everything that you want. All right? There are challenges that I have in order to be able to put information in the fashion that we would ideally want, and I agree, make perfect sense. But if we don't have the information collected in the fashion that allows for that, then I can't do that for you, okay? So one of the compromises that we've made to begin with is your information gets divided into kind of two categories. One of them we're referring to as a departmental category, and the other one is going to be a specific unit of analysis. And you can see my examples underneath each one of these, and I think it makes sense as to why they're in that category. So I'll pick on math. I always pick on math. I'm a math major, so I like to pick on math. If you think about math, they have a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD program. Their faculty support all of their programs. Their courses can be taken at multiple levels. You can get a little bit dicey as to, I mean, it makes a little more sense whether it's an undergrad or grad, but still there is crosses between that and things like that. So it's hard to get that to a unit of analysis. The expenditures, your research generation, all of those kinds of things, that's again faculty specific. So how do I actually say faculty X generated $100,000 in grants, and I'm going to give this % to the BA in math, and this % to the master's, and this % to the PhD? It doesn't make sense. So you're going to have some of these things at departmental level data. Some of the other things we can get down to very specific data. If we're going to talk about a BA in math, I know how many majors are in there. I know how many awards are in there. That's a unit of analysis specific measure, okay? And I just have a note on here too. When these things get shared and when they get posted to the website, you will have very specific definitions, as John alluded to, that defines how each one of the metrics are calculated. But just to give you an example of that data sheet, if you go to the next slide. So I just cut and paste two pieces of that sample data sheet that I showed you at the beginning. The very top one is the metric of the SCH for general education. It's a credit hour measurement. We are doing that at a departmental level data. It is not specific to a program. So if like in Missoula College, they have technical certificates and the associate degrees in some areas, I'm not splitting out those credit hours between the technical degree and the associate. It is the total for both of those units of analysis. We tried to give you visual cues so that you know which one is being evaluated, whether it's a departmental piece or a unit of analysis. I've circled in that top one 2 places that you'll see on your data sheet where it says it's departmental. Notice in the bottom one, which is degrees awarded now off that, I don't have departmental mentioned anywhere. So by default, that's unit of analysis. Also in the table, you're going to be able to see the wording change. One says the department for the unit of analysis, and the second one says just unit of analysis. So that's the distinction between the 2 pieces of data that you need to be aware of on the data sheet. Okay, next page. All right. Couple of things just in general about the data. And I should say, if you want to talk specifically about a metric, how it's calculated, and how it impacts your area, we're here. Call us. We'll talk about that. I'm not going to go into that level of detail during this presentation. But in general, some things that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at your data. We have an opinion that a metric should be a metric that answers all questions. One metric answers every question. And I want to encourage everybody to understand that that's not a reasonable expectation. Sometimes there is a need to modify the way the metric is calculated so that it can measure what it's really trying to answer. And that's a challenge then, because then everybody's like, well, you said over here my credit hours were this, and now all of a sudden you're saying they're this. So you got to pay real close attention to how you are defining that particular metric. And that's very important as you're going through this data, keep in mind what the definition of the metric is and what we're trying to capture. And don't get all worried about, oh, but you've lost all of these and the data's all wrong and that kind of stuff, okay? That's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing that keep in mind is that APASP has made the decision that when we talk about productivity, the way that we're going about that is we're going to do it by how the instructor is funded. Now that means that, and I think this is kind of common for the campus, this is how we've always done it, but that means that if you have collaborated with another department and you have not actually transferred money to that department, you could possibly be losing some credit hours. All right, so I'll pick on MPA and law. Okay, they have a joint program. And maybe their political science faculty are teaching a law course. But political science is paying for that faculty. Law is not going to get those credit hours. Political science is. Because what the metric is trying to measure is how have you used the resources that you are responsible for. Not so much the program resources, the whole political science program or law program, but how have those resources you've been earmarked and responsible for been used. So keep that in mind when you're looking at these things, and that's an important thing to understand, that they're always following the instructor. And then the other thing that happens then, if it's following the instructor, is we are a little bit lackadaisical in how we shuffle money around. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Everybody is taxed. They have lots of things that they're doing. And an extra step that we have to go through is hard. But what that means then, going back to my point, is I can't report the data the way that you want because we haven't gone through those steps. So there's two things that are kind of examples of what I'm talking about here. One of them is, let's just say for an example, the dean's office goes ahead and creates a sabbatical pool to help those departments as they go through the year. Perfectly logical and acceptable practice, okay? Department X comes to the dean and says, I need some replacement money. Dean says, good, you got it taken care of. You as the department think life's good. I'm okay, I've got my instructor, I'm good to go. What hasn't happened is the money has never left the dean's office and gone into the department. Keep in mind I said that the instructional hours are following the funding of the instructor. From my perspective, that instructor is now supporting education or instruction in the dean's office. I don't know what department he's in. That was an informal decision that was made between you guys and the dean's office, and it was never done through the data. So that makes it a real challenge from my perspective to be able to present the information the way that you want. Okay? So that's one example of where we need to understand some of the data limitations. A second one is that course release times appear to be a real concern when we start talking about FTE calculations. This again goes back to how we do our bookkeeping. Every dollar in the university is earmarked to identify what its purpose is. There is a national standard out there where there are 9 categories that dollars get bookmarked in. A dollar is either supposed to support instruction, research, public service, academic support, institutional support, waivers, operation, and I'm blanking on the public service, I think, if I didn't say it. But every dollar has to be earmarked to do that. So when I go to pull money, I determine how much the dollars that you've paid an instructor is supporting each of those areas. What we do on this campus is we pay out of an instructional area. The dollars are earmarked in an index that is listed as instruction. We don't identify whether or not they're really doing instruction. You've given them course releases. They have a department chair duty. They have all of these other things that are not really courses that they're teaching, which is what we call as instruction. So I go in and I look at it and you say, well, Professor X is actually getting paid 100% out of instruction. I have no way of knowing that you've given them release time to actually go off and direct this center, or that they get to do this particular research or whatever. So they're going to be reported in my information as 100% instruction. There's just no way I can get around it. So just be aware of those data limitations that you're looking at. The last bullet that I want to spend a little bit of time on is the task force spent a significant amount of time dealing with this issue of departmental data and unit of analysis data. And the spirit of program prioritization is really to look at the program, not the department. And the fact that our expenditures and our workforce are going to be linked at a department data and repeated, no matter, going back to my math example, it would be the exact same faculty supporting the BA, supporting the MA, and supporting the PhD. That was a concern to the task force. So just recently, you've not seen any data on this, we haven't been able to put it together, but just recently, in fact, as of yesterday, I think they voted on this, we've decided that we're going to actually take your faculty and we're going to split them into an undergrad and a grad number. Now that's still not going to solve all the problems, but it gets us a little bit closer. And it's going to be done centrally using a mathematical formula. Here's how it's going to work. We're going to go through our regular hoops and we're going to determine how much a faculty FTE should be. So the particular example that I have here is the faculty is in instruction at a 0.8. We're not going to report them as a 0.8 anymore. For the bachelor's program, we've determined that this instructor is teaching 300 credit hours. For the graduate program, which is courses 5 and 6, we're not looking at programs here. I really shouldn't have said programs. It really is the courses. For the 400 and below courses, they're teaching 300 credit hours. For the 500 and 600 level courses, they're teaching 100 credit hours. So what that basically means is 75% of that 0.8 FTE is going to the undergraduate programs, and 25% of that 0.8 FTE is going to the graduate programs. That is how we're going to be splitting out the faculty. Okay? I knew there'd be questions on that one.
Sorry for interrupting, and thanks for all the work you've done on this data. I'm sure this is not easy. And I just have a question about if we do run across a inconsistency between the how something's funded and how it's taught, such as sabbatical replacement or an online course that is captured in the dean's office, for example. How can we note that to you? Is there an opportunity to respond saying actually the data may look like this,
Yes.
according from our perspective?
You have a couple of areas, whatever works best for the flow of your information. Probably the easiest way to go about that is each one of these metrics in the criteria, you have a whole set of metrics. You have 250 words to talk about all those metrics. And sometimes that's a little bit challenging because there may be 10 of them there and you might want to say a whole lot about it. But you do have that area where you can come back and say, you know what, Dawn just got this totally wrong. I think this is what we need to be doing. It's like, yeah, but, and actually I joke about that because you do want to be careful because the task force does know the challenges of the data. So you don't want to spend all your time saying, I don't agree with how you've gone about this. It's not representing my program or whatever. Instead, you want to understand the data that we have provided, and then you want to provide those extra pieces to say, yeah, this is spot on. Art has this many. We paid this amount. But we also have this amount that's in the dean's office that's not being captured because it wasn't transferred. That's how you want to present concerns about the data, not just, it's all wrong, you can't measure me on it, okay?
Don, the data is great. You know, we've looked at it, y'all worked very hard and the data is good, but this last change is going to be a bit of a problem for us, how you calculate the graduate students, because for administrative purposes, we list me as directing all the thesis credit hours and not the faculty who are doing it. So their proportions are going to be way off on that.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, I need to get together, and I talked with Tom a little bit. I need to get together with you guys and actually think about the complexity in forestry is a step above, because they're more of a college level view and not even a departmental level view. So I think we need to strategize about how to go about that, and there might be opportunities. Okay.
John, I would also say thank you again for all your hard work. I guess I do have a concern about that last piece as well. When you really think about it, it feels like load, if you will, for faculty is really only being perceived as, again, student credit hours. So I even go back to the example earlier of pharmacy. We are in the very same, I'm in communicative sciences and disorders. So again, ratios for a program where you're going out and providing clinical service in a supervised way, you are only getting 2 students for every, let's just say a 3-credit class, six student credit hours for 1 professor compared to that professor also doing an undergraduate class. So I would say if I'm looking at their load during a week, they have 2 3-credit courses. 8 hours one day, let's just think of a 40-hour week, is for graduate students doing a clinically supervised load where there are 6 student credit hours being generated at a graduate level, versus say day 2 is a 3-credit class, and it is your typical undergraduate class, 50 students, for example, in a and however many student credit hours that will then have. And so if you look at this formula, I would say that those are equal loads. But this one now skews it to whatever percentage of your time is for undergraduates, right? And so, and again, then not even that, well, one day of that week I would say was the service piece and all the advising or whatever. And so I understand you're limited in the formulas that you can use, but I do see a real problem with this in terms of skewing, especially graduate programming. It actually skews toward quantity, not the actual quality piece.
Yeah.
So I just a thought, and I'm sure we can explain it, but I do see this as being very skewed.
Yeah, no, and thank you for that, Julie. And if it gives you any rest on this, the committee probably spent 2 hours talking that exact same thing. Okay, we could look at it just in terms of the credit hours that they're generating, or we could, and I mean credit hours of a course. You're teaching 2 3-hour courses, you got 6 hours. Or do you actually talk about the impact of the students? And it just felt like for the campus overall, this was the best way to go about it. But you're absolutely right, address that if it is skewing your program.
I will say that one of the approaches you should think about in your writing is this is the way we do work in our department because it works for our department. It is necessary for us to deliver our curriculum in this manner, and that's why our numbers look this way. And I think that's a good way of approaching some of these challenges in the quantitative central data.
I just want to reiterate the last comment, because the minute I see this, I see that kind of breakdown by student credit hour. If you think about our program, if we have 15 grad students finishing just the thesis credits alone, so that's 45 credit hours, but it does not represent time and effort that the faculty is devoting. And the other thing I would note is, and I don't know any way to do this, but it also isn't representing the difference. I mean, we're looking at student credit hours. How much revenue do they bring in? Grad students pay 10% more, and our program is about 3/4 out of state. So those credit hours that you're breaking down by FTE for faculty may be lower for grad students, but the revenue to the university is higher. So, and that isn't apparently in the equation.
And you're right, it's not. And then that's where I go back to, let's not try and make one metric answer all of the questions. We're not factoring in revenue generation in this particular thing. We're really trying to get at kind of a productivity thing.
Hello, this is a question specifically about the data, and thank you for all the work on it. And I know it's impossible to capture everything the way each of us would like it captured. With the attrition that we've all experienced over the last few years of lines, we actually have people who are not faculty but teach a significant number of classes and are full-time and even lead programs that are paid by soft money from the foundation. Are they captured in this data?
Yes, all
Okay.
dollars are reported on that. And not to belabor the point, but that's an important thing to understand from some of the information that my office has produced before, is that we only focused on general funds. And in those cases, soft money wasn't necessarily picked up. In this case, we are, but I have to put a caveat on this, and I think this is going to impact you guys. We go back to how the individual is paid, okay? And if you're talking about credit hours and ratios and stuff like that, they should be paid as instruction, okay? The reason why we lose a lot of the SOBA credit hours is because you're paying them out of soft money, and that soft money is earmarked to be institutional support and not instruction. So it's not being excluded because it's soft money, it's being excluded because we're not told it's meant to support instruction, okay? So there could still be some inconsistencies there, so don't take that answer of yes, they're in there. You got to fit all of the little buckets.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Will we receive data sheets from your office for those self-support programs, academic programs that are offered through CEL?
Is it listed as a unit of analysis?
Yes.
Yes. But your guys' is a challenge. We may need to visit a little bit about it because I don't quite understand how our data is showing the two different programs that you guys are actually running. Okay.
Hi, David Affleck from Forestry. I'm just wondering, it sounds like we'll be asked to respond to a lot of this data, and we'll need to do a fair amount of explaining about some of these things, that how they're being captured. Will we have access to the complete set of data to allow us to find some of those, or only to the data for our unit or our department?
That's a great question. There are limitations. The general answer is yes. I want to be completely transparent with you. The caveat that I have to give is the magnitude of those requests that we might get, because right now the only way we can get that is through a manual extraction out of our stuff and then sending it to you. So please, I encourage you to request that information if you're interested in it, and we will do our very best to get it to you, okay?
If we made requests for that July 31st deadline related to our specific unit and the data, how do we make sense of whether or not those things were taken into account or not? Is that something to do individually, or do we just wait till our data comes?
And that's a great question. Timing of this going fast and furious has been a problem. We are trying to put together a spreadsheet with every question. By the way, we got over 450 responses during our data thing. So we're trying to document all of those questions and then the resolution that came out of that. But we are behind on that. What I can tell you is that all of them were considered in the final way that the definition was put together, but we may not have been able to communicate that back to you. So you have two choices. You can wait till next week and kind of see how the final definition ended up, or if you're curious right now, talk to me and we'll figure it out, okay?
Some 400 level courses are UG courses that can be taken by graduate students for graduate credit. Will that count in this computation of the graduate FTE?
No, it is strictly based on the course numbers. So 400 is undergrad.
I just wanted to comment a little bit about the concerns people have about this last point. in the previous formula, you were getting your student credit hours divided by the total faculty FTE. So essentially your credit hours were getting double counted. So for example, in forestry, your number for your productivity on the graduate level is going to look great since there's a maximum of 1 FTE going to be applied to that. So effectively, I think what this does is overall make the student credit hour to faculty FTE ratios look better.
Yes. Thank you, Bruce. That is one thing that we were trying to accomplish.
Related to that question about the comments we put in on 731, is it possible to have just the data that was up in July for us to comment on? Is that archived somewhere? Because when we get the new data, I would like to be able to see were there any changes made or not.
Sure. That's a great question. I will be honest with you, I don't know if we thought through the possibility of needing to do that, and we may have written over as we've made modifications, but let me go back and double check. We may have some archived somewhere that we can get back to that point. Okay. Okay, one last slide, and we've talked about most of this, but just to kind of wrap things all up on the data. So understand the challenges that you're going to see from the centrally provided data, that we are following the instructor where they're paid, okay? We don't always have instruction representing what we want it to. Release time is not recorded in there. Chair reduction in courseworks and all that is not, we're not able to get that, so that's a challenge. APASP has wanted the numerators and the denominators to be from the same population, so this goes back to the comment I made before where I said if your dean actually paid for the instructor, your department lost the credit hours because I cannot put that instructor in your unit or your department. Therefore, any credit hours are not going to your unit or department. It's the same group between the numerator and the denominator. So kind of how you address them, as I was saying, is that, you know, we all recognize these guys know all the challenges that are out there with the data. So it is not in your best interest to just say your data is totally wrong. Instead, understand what we are presenting and talk about how that needs to be supplemented with some other information that only you guys have. Okay? I think there's a question.
Is there one more question? Nadia.
Yeah, I just wanted to check on the time frame. Does the data capture stop at spring of 2017?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And that's an important thing to understand, even though we are into 18, and 18 has had some of its own challenges. It has been very important throughout this process that we look at expenditure information and not budgeted information. Because of a lot of this movement and this planning that we do, the budget is very, very different than what ends up in the expenses. So that means the only data that we can provide through this right now is through FY17, spring 17.
If there aren't any other questions, we're going to move on to a few report writing suggestions. This is on.
Hello?
I'm Amy Kinch. I direct the Faculty Development Office, and Kelly Webster from the Writing Center and I are 2 of 7 author trainers who've been working with the task force and also trying to learn from academic strategy partners, which is the group that came here last spring, just trying to compile some tips that might make tackling these reports and the writing of them, which we appreciate is a really difficult task, might make that a little bit easier. So we've pulled together just a few suggestions. A written copy of these tips will be on the website, as will all of the PowerPoints you've seen today, Dawn's sample sheet, and a number of other resources. Those will all be on the training page of the APASP webpage. So the first set of suggestions was just sort of about how to start tackling this. It sounds like a lot of you have already made quite a bit of progress on this, but just a few notes on developing content. The APASP process is similar to program or unit standards review, but the committee wants to discourage the use sort of just the reproduction of reports. You can certainly mine reports for key information, but you definitely write a new report in response to the APASP context. The materials that you're going to submit likely will be made available to the public, so keep that in mind when addressing personnel issues or proprietary operational information, and be advised that all the centralized data that Dawn's reporting is also public information. You're encouraged to use data that you all have collected in addition to what Dawn's providing, so feel free to use any assessment data or anything else your units are routinely collecting to describe your unit and your impact. And as John mentioned, really a main focus should be conveying the role of your unit and its contribution to the university or to a component of the university. That's sort of a central thing to keep in mind as you're writing all of the responses to all of the criteria. For formatting, the length of responses, as you can see on the form, is limited and specific to each criteria. Concise language and prioritization of the most important information will be crucial, obviously, to the report. There is no penalty for not using all of the allowed 250 words, and I'm sure the committee might appreciate some of you more concise responses, but do be sure to give comprehensive answers, because some people, I think, shortchange the answers a little bit in the pilot. So go for comprehensive and precise as opposed to every single one of the 250 words. This would be my recommendation. Does that sound good? Consider using tables or charts to represent complex information now that we can submit those through Exceed. We've had folks want to know if they could collaborate in Exceed, and as Dawn mentioned, we're suggesting not doing that. If you want to do collaborative work, try to do it in Word or another software program, and then think of Exceed as your submission platform. But I would get in there, before the day you're going to submit it, just to make sure you understand, if you decide you want to build a table in there or any of the formatting questions, just check it out a little bit before the deadline. Using bullets with supporting data for some sections was pretty effective for folks in the pilot, so that might be a way to be concise and efficient. Describe data sources with specificity. So an example might be that you would say, according to the 2015 American Association of Engineering Student Survey, as opposed to AAE survey, as opposed to a survey with no date. Just be as detailed as possible, but also concise. There's been a lot of conversations about whether or not to use links, but keep in mind that links will use up your word count, so putting a ton of links in there may not be the greatest strategy for efficiency. And in that same vein, don't assume that readers will look up data outside of your report. Don't link to annual reports or write available upon request. The committee will not have time to review additional material or websites.
So I'm going to add just a few more, the next slide, yeah, I'll add just a few more strategies and tips, and this is really coming from the perspective, Amy and I obviously are fellow authors who are faced with the same challenge that is the APASP report. One of the nice things about the pilot that the task force did is that they were able to glean from the pilot some of the common, both pitfalls that they noticed in folks' reports, but also some of the good strategies that people took. So we want to try to distill some of those down for all of you. And by the way, Amy, you may have said this, but all of these tips will also be posted to the website as well as the slides. So obviously, many of you taking notes, and you've been thinking about this for a while, already have a lot of ideas for what kind of content, evidence, data that you can include in your reports. But when you think about the reviewers reading 430 reports, really a large part of the ball game is us being able to communicate as clearly and efficiently as possible to make our reports accessible. We said to the group yesterday to keep in mind that the reviewers have the best of intentions. They want to see the value of our programs. So our task is to try to remove the barriers for them to be able to see the value of our programs. And so some of these tips are trying to get at that. So acknowledging that we're all writing in a very challenging context, the stakes feel high, the stakes are high for us. that it's wise for us to orient our reports as positively as possible by focusing on the possibilities for our programs rather than dwelling extensively on the wrongs that have been impacting our programs. So trying to be as forward-looking as possible. Other institutions that have gone through this process have given us the advice that reports that come across as primarily complaining can be read negatively by the reviewers. So I think, of course, we should acknowledge the constraints that have existed for our programs, but to keep the overall tone positive. So, for example, instead of using lots of our word count to explain the deep cuts that have happened to our programs, kind of reframing and talking about unmet demand and what we could do if we had the resources that we need or that we've lost. So in other words, remembering that really our primary task is to argue for our programs' potential contributions and existing contributions for the university. B, to use Dawn's word, as efficient as possible when mentioning errors in data and to try to do that in the appropriate places. And to remember that our primary task is to put as much energy as possible into explaining why our programs are structured the way they are and how that structure helps students in the university. So why have you been and why will you continue to be valuable and essential to the institution? So using our limited space to evidence our value to the institution. Similarly, remembering to address your unit's past performance or budgeting, but trying to connect that to information and the rationale for future opportunities for our programs. One of the big points of feedback that we heard from the task force after they had looked at the pilot reports was that it was often difficult to find the verifiable information. So when programs would make kind of subjective claims or have these vague platitudes about the excellence of their program, to remember that our task is to earn the right to make those claims, and we earn the right by providing the evidence, the data, the examples in order to say our program is distinguished nationally. So try to remember to move beyond just those abstract or subjective claims to provide the reasons why that's valid or why that's the case. Also, really important, and we'll talk about some workshops that we'll be offering, the trainers will be offering in the future that will help us with this. Remember that we're writing for a general audience. Remember that APASP reviewers most likely will not be specialists in your discipline or in your content area. And so it's important that we both remember to avoid jargon or discipline-specific language that may not be easily accessible to a general audience. Try to avoid that language. But also, our task for this general audience is to prioritize the information that's most important for them to know. Obviously, the 250-word limit forces us to do that. So keep in mind that sort of the potential curse of knowledge, where you as an expert have so much knowledge in your area, you talk to other experts about your area all the time, and everything feels important. I want to be able to say everything about the Writing Center. But I have to find ways to both communicate clearly with someone who doesn't know what we do and maybe doesn't value it, and I have to be able to prioritize which information is going to be most persuasive to that audience. So, I mean, in effect, this really is an argumentative type of task. And then last, test the clarity of your writing by having others, certainly within your area, but I think especially outside your area, look at your draft report and ask them, as someone who's not an expert in my area, am I answering the question? Do you feel convinced? Does this make sense? What's confusing? I think a lot of times, I know this is true for me, I think I've been really, really clear. And then someone from outside my area reads something I've written and I realize I actually have not been clear for a general audience. So as many dress rehearsals as possible. The analogy we used the other day, many of you have been on search committees where there is an applicant you know or an internal applicant and you know that person is a rock star and they don't give you the information that you need to make good decisions about that person, you may be a really fabulous program. You don't want the task force to be in a position where they're thinking, gosh, why didn't they say X, Y, and Z about their program? Oh, one other thing I want to say before I mention the workshops that wasn't mentioned, and I'll show you the website in a second. When you're writing the reports, don't make the mistake of only looking at the criteria. Also look at the rubric. The rubric highlights the weighting, which obviously is a clue to us regarding what the reviewers value and to what extent they value those things. So I would recommend as you're writing, be certainly writing to the criteria, but also be looking at the rubric. So it tells us how those criteria will be interpreted by the readers. I think that's an important piece to keep in mind. So we will have some workshops in order to help facilitate feedback processes in addition to the feedback that you're receiving from peers. And so you can see up here on the slide, we'll have a couple for administrative services and a couple for academic programs. And these essentially will be sessions where you can bring your draft report and we will facilitate a session where we're having others read our reports and give us feedback, but also an opportunity to see how other people are tackling this challenge that is the APASP report. And then closer to the deadline, we'll have some more specific kind of polishing, proofing sessions for folks. So please take a look at the website, and information will be updated continuously. Actually, can we pull up the website? So on the website, just so that you can, many of you obviously have already visited it, keep in mind that APASP, the APASP committee is persistently updating the website, so visiting it often, although now the criteria and metrics and all of those sorts of things are finalized. But just a real quick navigation, Amy showed you earlier, if you go to the About button and then that's where you'll find the terms and definitions. Of course, pay attention to those because those give us insight into how the task force has agreed to interpret certain terms. So even the term essential, what's essential, essential services, is a term that they've tried to, that they have defined in there. Terms like diversity, sustainability that are in the UM 2020 plan, there are definitions in there, in addition to the acronyms. Also, if you go to the APASP process page, that's where you'll find not only the criteria and metrics and rubrics, but also the categories that our programs will ultimately be assigned to or put into. And in fact, some of the language in these categories is also defined in the definitions and terms sheet. So there's a host of resources here. There's also a site for the author training, so you can find that there. And this is, I presume, where we'll put up these PowerPoints and some of these other materials. Okay, any other questions?
This is back a question for Dawn. On the units of analysis for the math department, we have often 2 authors listed. Will both of the listed authors receive these communications and reminder messages if they are listed in that sheet?
Still to be determined. What I have been told is I can only give you one ID, and if the system is actually automating the emails, then I have to come up with a plan B. I know there's going to be a need to have a supplemental person getting the information.
Please try to do that. It should be possible to have 2 email addresses associated with one report. That would be really helpful.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's actually necessary in a lot of cases. People are going to be out of town, so we're working on that.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions, that's all we have for today. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.